You've heard me talk about the fourth turning. And I was lucky enough back in 1993, 94, I had the privilege of working with the President of the United States, Bill Clinton. And you couldn't do this today, but simultaneously I was working with the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, on the other side. I literally left the White House, went over, passed across the Capitol, and worked on the other side on the same day. And the reason I mention it to you is Bill Clinton was the first person who told me about this book called Generations by Strauss and Howe. And this book was basically 500 years of Anglo-American history, and it showed that history is shaped by generations and generations are shaped by history. It was a fascinating book, and it talked about, the book was written in 1991, that in 2020 there'll be this crisis that we'll be facing, and it was predicted because of how generations raise the next generation, how we then interpret history. You can have events, but they're interpreted differently by a different model of the world. And I thought it was fascinating. And then in 1997, I was going to Borders bookstore, one of those places, and I always go by the bin where the non-popular books are because I'm a contrarian. I found some of my favorite books in those places. And it was in that thing, like marked down 70% or 50%, some ridiculous number. And I picked up the book, and it was Strauss and Howe again. And I picked up this book, and it's been one of the guidebooks for me to understand what the hell's happening in our world ever since. It really helped me understand the patterns, because if you think about it, we talk about power of patterns. What's the most powerful pattern of all? You've heard me talk about it before, that changed humanity, that took us from starving, running around as hunter-gatherers, to where we could stay in one place. It was one distinction. What was it? Recognizing the seasons. Understanding, see, before that it was looked random. You planted in the winter, you didn't even know it was winter, you just knew it was cold. And for some reason you worked your ass off and you got nothing for it. And what I began to look at here is like humanity, once it understood the seasons and knew when to plant and when not to. If you do the right thing at the wrong time, what kind of reward do you get? Zilch, nothing. So all of a sudden humanity understood this, and now we could stay in one place, we could build a community, we could build cities, we could build countries. That one distinction changed all of humanity. But there's also the seasons of your own life that's so valuable to understand. Think of it as 4 seasons of your life. 0 to 20, roughly, is your springtime. But that initial springtime, you're learning, you're growing, probably protected, you're absorbing things. That's the stage. Some people starts at 16, 14, some say 19, 20, but let's just call it around 21, you enter a different stage of life. You become kind of the soldier of life. You enter the summertime. 21 to 41, that's a different stage, isn't it? Now you go out in the world and say, I'm going to test this stuff. I was told all this shit. What's true? And you think you're going to be a billionaire or 10 times billionaire, and you're going to be president of the United States, and you're going to have 100 relationships, and it's all going to work out smoothly. And then you get your first relationship and discover none of that shit is true. And you start to understand that you have vulnerabilities. You find out you're not invincible. So this young adulthood is testing and discovering, just trying to figure out what's really real. That's when we learn a lot. And usually some of it is painful because it's not quite like we expected. But you're the soldier of society. Quite literally, that's where soldiers are, right? 21 to 41 usually, right? You're the person that goes to war. You're the person that's out there doing the hard work. Now, if you really grew in spring and you really grew in summer, then there's the fall, the autumn. And that means 42 to 62 is a real reaping time if you've grown. If you're not grown, like if you don't plant in the spring, you're going to weep in the fall. You're not going to reap in the fall, right? But if you push through the hot summer, it's a difficult time, those 21 to 41. By the way, when you ask people, when you do all the research on people, what's the most unhappy time of their life? It's that 2 decades. Not for every human, but for most. Because trying to figure out who the hell you are, prove to yourself, make it through all the bullshit, trying to figure what's going on in your life. But when you get to 42 to 62, again, if you've grown, if you've not grown, you're kind of stunted. There's not much crop. But now you're really in your midlife power, and you get to start to have a harvest time. This is for a lot of people their greatest financial time of their life, because they built up understanding and they worked hard and developed skill sets, and now they're in a position to lead. They might start running an organization. They start to really grow, to expand. And then 63 to 83, you could think of as winter, and 83 to 120 is the oldest living humans. If you're fortunate enough, maybe you'll have an extended winter. But in this stage, you really end up being a leader who's really there to mentor. That's really the position you're in. It's like what I love most now. It's like the example I give you of playing a video game against a child. You know the child's always going to win. And it's not because they're faster and smarter. It's because they played this game a million times. They know the first bad guy's here, the next bad guy's here, the next bad guy's here. So they're able to do something really important. This is what today is all about, if you want it in a simple phrase. Anticipation is power. Anticipation is power. Leaders anticipate. Losers react. If you and I are going to have a great quality of life for our families, for our communities, for anybody we want to serve, our job is to anticipate. In order to do that, you got to recognize patterns. So these seasons of your life are precious. Every season has different challenges, right? How many can remember some of the challenges of the springtime of your life? I remember some of the challenges of the summer in that stage, the things you wrestled with. Some are still there. How many remember the fall experiences, right? So everything has opportunity, everything has challenge, and if you can anticipate the challenge, you can make that season a hell of a lot more enjoyable. So there's the patterns of nature, there's the patterns of your life, the seasons of your life, and what we're going to look at this morning is seasons of history. Because if you understand the seasons of history interact with what stage of life you're in, like some people, 0 to 20 is when they experience winter. Historical winter, because there's one about every 80 years, as you'll see shortly. And so some people enter winter in midlife. Some people do it at their power stage. Some people towards the end of life. If you have a full life, you're going to experience all 4 seasons. But all of us in our first 2 seasons of life, meaning your spring, 0 to 20, your 21 to 42, are going to either experience an awakening, an internal turmoil within the country around values, like you saw in the 60s and 70s, or you're going to experience a crisis, right? Because that's the cycle. Everyone experiences them. But depending upon when your generation experiences that shapes the way you look at life, the way you interact, and what you do. But it might be nice to anticipate where that is. So there are these seasons. I just want to give you the big picture. So we got to think of the seasons of nature, the seasons of your life, and the seasons of history. And if you understand them, you start to be able to predict. So this book in 1991 says in 2020, we're going to have this giant crisis, but in the fourth turning, it's even more specific. Here are some of the prophecies that were there as we go to introduce it. That there'll be, 25 years ago, there'll be a global terrorist group that blows up an aircraft. There'll be an impasse of federal budgets that reaches a stalemate with a government shutdown. There'll be anarchy within the former Soviet Republic, and Russia is going to conduct training exercise on its borders. And the CDC is going to announce a